Hello and welcome. In this session, we will explore the critical steps to configure and manage your Microsoft Entra tenant, with a specific focus on handling domains within Microsoft Entra ID and Microsoft 365. Let's get started. To begin, we must define what we are managing. A tenant is essentially your organization's container within Microsoft Entra ID. It holds all your directory objects, such as users and application registrations. When you first create a tenant, Microsoft assigns an initial domain that ends in on Microsoft.com. While this ensures immediate functionality, it is rarely what you want your end users to see. This initial domain is permanent, however. To provide a professional experience, such as having users sign in as name at Contoso.com rather than the long default name, you will configure custom domains. This slide visualizes the tenant as the central hub for your identity management. This diagram illustrates the structure of a Microsoft Entra tenant. At the top, we have the tenant itself, acting as the secure container. Moving down, you see it holds directory objects, specifically users, groups, and applications. On the right, we distinguish between the two types of domains attached to the tenant. First, the initial domain, which is the default on Microsoft.com address generated upon creation. Second, the custom domain, which represents your organization's branded identity, such as Contoso.com, that we will be adding to improve the user experience. Now, let's look at the how of adding a custom domain. You start by accessing the Microsoft Entra Admin Center. You must hold the role of domain name administrator or global administrator to perform this task. Once in the portal, you navigate to the domain names blade and initiate the Add Custom Domain process. It is critical to type the full domain name, such as Contoso.com. At this stage, Microsoft Entra ID knows you want to use this domain, but it doesn't trust you own it yet. Therefore, the status will initially appear as unverified. You cannot use the domain for user sign-ins until we complete the verification step, which involves proving you control the DNS records. This sequence diagram details the interaction for adding a domain. The administrator begins by interacting with the Entra Admin Center. When the admin submits the new domain name, the portal sends a request to Microsoft Entra ID. Entra ID registers the domain object, but marks it unverified because it lacks proof of ownership. Finally, the portal displays the necessary DNS information, specifically the TXT or MX record that the administrator needs for the next step of verification. To convert your domain from unverified to verified, you must prove ownership. Microsoft Entra ID generates a specific text record, usually starting with MS=, which acts as a challenge token. You must log into your domain registrar, such as GoDaddy, and add this TXT record to your DNS zone. We recommend setting the time to live, or TTL, to 60 minutes to ensure rapid propagation. Once added, return to the Azure portal and click Verify. If it fails immediately, wait a short while for the DNS changes to propagate across the internet. Note that you cannot use internal-only domains like local because they are not routable on the public internet. This flow shows the verification loop. It starts with Microsoft Entra ID generating a challenge token. The administrator takes this token and adds it as a TXT record at their domain registrar. The DNS system propagates this change. When the admin clicks Verify in the portal, Entra ID queries the DNS system. If the record resolves and matches the token, the domain status changes to verified. If not, the admin must wait and retry later. Once verified, you likely want your custom domain to be the default. By setting it as the primary domain, any new user you create directly in the portal will default to it Contoso.com instead of the initial domain. To do this, select the domain in the Admin Center and choose Make Primary. Ideally, you do this immediately after verification. It is important to note that you cannot set a federated domain one where authentication happens on premises as the primary domain. Also, remember that changing this setting acts as a template for new users. It does not retroactively rename existing user accounts in your directory. This state diagram tracks the primary domain status. We start in the initial state where the on Microsoft.com domain is primary. We transition to state 2 when a custom domain is verified. From here, the admin selects Make Primary to reach state 3. Consequently, any new user created flows from state 3, automatically receiving the custom UPN suffix. The diagram also notes a constraint. If a domain becomes federated, it loops back, as it cannot serve as the primary domain. Advanced configurations often require subdomains like Contoso.com. If you have already verified Contoso.com, adding the subdomain is usually automatic and requires no extra DNS work. However, a critical concept is inheritance. Subdomains inherit the authentication type of the parent. This means if your main domain is federated to an on-premises server, the subdomain defaults to federated too. If you need the subdomain to be managed to cloud-only authentication, while the parent is federated, you cannot fix this in the portal. You must use the Microsoft Graph API to promote the subdomain to a root domain status, breaking that inheritance. This class diagram visualizes the relationship between domains. The root domain has an authentication type, for example, federated. The subdomain naturally inherits settings from the root domain. The dotted line represents the action taken via Microsoft Graph API. By promoting the subdomain, it becomes a promoted subdomain whereas root is set to true. This breaks the inheritance, allowing its authentication type to be set to managed independently of the parent. Sometimes you need to remove a domain. This is often blocked because resources like users or email proxies still use that domain name. To resolve this without manually editing every user, you can use the force delete option. This operation runs in the background and automatically renames all users carrying the custom domain back to the initial, on Microsoft. Com domain, however, be aware of the limits. Force delete will fail if you have over 1,000 references or if the domain is tied to specific multi-tenant applications. In those high-volume cases, you must clean up the references manually or via script before deletion. This troubleshooting flowchart guides you through domain deletion. Starting at the top, the system checks for existing references like users or groups. If none exist, deletion succeeds. If references exist, you must decide whether to use force delete. If you don't, you get an error. If you do use force delete, the system checks if the reference count exceeds 1,000. If it does, the operation fails, requiring manual cleanup. If under 1,000, the system performs an asynchronous rename of users to the default domain, allowing the deletion to proceed. To summarize, managing your Microsoft Entra tenant effectively hinges on correct domain configuration. We've covered how the tenant acts as the secure container and how custom domains provide the necessary branding for user identities. As a critical best practice, always maintain emergency access accounts, often called break glass accounts. These should use the initial, on Microsoft, com domain, ensuring you can still sign in even if your custom domain's DNS configuration fails or federation breaks. Following these verification and management procedures ensures a secure and resilient identity infrastructure. This mind map consolidates our training. At the center is tenant management. Branching out, we have domains, covering the life cycle of adding, verifying, and setting primary domains. The security branch emphasizes the need for break glass accounts on the initial domain and federation options. Finally, maintenance covers advanced topics like subdomain inheritance, using force delete for cleanup, and utilizing the Graph API for complex configurations.